No one really cares about A Bug's Life. No, put down your hands. Okay, I suppose there are people who care about A Bug's Life. But you know what I mean, though? A Bug's Life feels like Pixar's lost film. That film that gets glossed over when you go over their great history in cinema. And I wonder why that is. Is it because of the whole ants thing? Or is it because it just got sandwiched between two Toy Story movies? All of their other early work also got sequels, from Monsters, Inc. to Finding Nemo, to Cars, to The Incredibles in 2018. But where is the love for the ant colony? They should thank their lucky stars Disney was building a theme park at the time, or they wouldn't be in anything. A Bug's Life is probably Pixar's most interesting film to study from an evolutionary standpoint. With Toy Story, it was their first effort, them building the framework of what a CGI film can do. But here's where you start to see them make tweaks, start playing with the formula, and changing the scope of the movie. Whereas Toy Story is a very intimate and relationship-driven film, A Bug's Life is more about the big picture, about how to change an entire system. I would argue that it's one of Pixar's most political films, if you want to read the allegory that way. There aren't many Pixar films that really tackle a systemic issue head-on. You look at a film like Wall-E as an example, which does ask bigger questions about the environment and the human spirit, but it's still primarily viewed through the lens of a love story between two characters. What's cool about A Bug's Life is that these issues are totally naked. The focus is always on the disparity between the grasshoppers and the ants. There's a very deliberate capitalism or class system allegory here, with the grasshoppers taking the role of the 1%. The grasshoppers have built a system in which they will be continually fed, and the majority ants submit to them as their lot in life. It reminds me a bit of what Toy Story 3 did later on with the Sunnyside daycare setup. A group very deliberately constructs a system for the benefits of themselves, with the sacrifice of the many who infinitely shuffle through its doors. I think one of the smartest decisions about this film is the inclusion of the cantina scene. It's not essential or anything, since you could argue that the grasshoppers will return later anyway. But here's where they get a little bigger philosophically, demonstrating very clearly that the grasshoppers already have enough to eat. And that by returning, this is really about them enforcing the system they have built. It makes me think of the totalitarian discussion in something like 1984. That simply the thought or idea of resistance needs to be stamped out immediately, that a small seed cannot be allowed to grow. If you want a vision of the future, imagine a grasshopper's foot stamping on an ant's face forever. It's also cool because it's a recreation of Flick and Dot's discussion in Act 1 with the seed, or rock. It cleverly links Flick and Hopper together, in that they both fully understand the concept behind the seed, that even something small can grow into something mighty. Even Hopper himself accepts this thesis as being true. What makes him a great villain is that he distorts this truth into something self-serving, emphasizing the ant's smallness through verbal and physical intimidation. And the fact that he's played by Kevin Spacey, who totally owns psychological manipulation. You notice that Hopper himself does not do anything overtly violent toward the ants. It's only the threat of it that matters. He glares at people and lectures them and tells them what will happen, and he'll pick up Dot and wave her around in front of that crazy grasshopper Thumper, but he won't hurt Dot himself. Even in the showdown with Flick at the film's climax, he has Thumper do the beating. Once again, we're establishing the hierarchy, that Hopper is the 1% of the 1%. Hopper will smack around the other grasshoppers and his own brother to keep them in line. But when it comes to the ants, Hopper is not the one who should get his hands dirty. Speaking of which, the ant colony itself serves as the base of the story, but sometimes struggles at being interesting on its own. The ants are mostly reactive agents, only responding when something new or quirky happens. They don't drive a lot of the humor either, they only really open up when the circus arrives. This results in a very dry and businesslike Act 1. They set up the situation and introduce the characters, but there is very little flavor. Very little in terms of world building or establishing key character relationships. Princess Ada's arc about her leadership falls flat, because the story is never really told from her point of view. She just introduces herself at the beginning and then just keeps mentioning how inadequate she feels. There's nothing about others judging her or criticizing her, it's mostly a lot of hand-wringing. Her relationship with the Queen is hardly a thing at all. Probably the best thing about Act 1 is the establishment of the seed metaphor. Not just for setup purposes, but because it's a fun character moment for Flick and Dot. Dot is one of the few non-boring ants that would have an actual conversation with Flick, and Flick is the kind of personality who doesn't let things go. They lay out this metaphor in probably the least subtle way possible, repeating it over and over and over again. Yes, we get it. Even the smallest person can grow to be someone great. You're ants. We see why this is an appropriate message. But given how this is the central theme of the whole thing, and this being a family film and all, they're probably right to spell it out in such clear language. The film doesn't really get going in earnest until Flick takes flight and reaches the Bug City. That's when the circus bugs get introduced and Pixar really starts flexing its world-building muscles. I love how everything is built from scratch, that all the building materials and background characters were all chosen very carefully and deliberately. Stuff like fashioning a tin can into a bar, with insects perched along the wall, or a mosquito hanging out, enjoying some O-negative blood. It reminds me of the kind of thing that makes Star Wars great, that ability to show us a completely alien world. This sort of thing is extremely commonplace these days in CGI films, just look at something like Zootopia. But A Bug's Life is remarkable because it's Pixar's first stab at creating a secret world, and they pull it off beautifully. This is where Flick meets the circus bugs and has his hilarious misunderstanding that drives the rest of the film. These guys are a lot of fun, of course, acting as the main source of comic relief. I really like Denis Leary's performance as Francis the Ladybug. It's a seemingly cheap kind of joke, but he delivers it so deadpan and so tired of it all that he keeps it fresh. His begrudging friendship with the Blueberry Troupe is quite heartwarming as well. The two pill bugs certainly bring a lot of fun slapstick, although I can't help but retrospectively get Minion vibes these days. The rest of them are fun too, but I feel are a little one-note or are underused. Heimlich is a walking fat joke, while Slim does variations on a stick. I wish we would have gotten a little more of Madeline Kahn's character in particular, since she was such a comedy legend. Oh, and I hate P.T. Flea, but more on that later. Pixar played it really smart with the story pacing for these guys. Whenever you have a misunderstanding plot, there's sort of a juggling act going on, between enjoying the dramatic irony of the situation, but not making everyone into oblivious idiots. We get a nice little scene of them showing off their stuff and the ants accepting it, but it doesn't drag. They immediately go to school, pull the rug out from under them, and we can move on in the plot. They do a nice job of demonstrating a progression with these guys, first enjoying the attention and adoration, and eventually wanting to call the place home. This is also where the seeds of change really begin to grow. I love the usage of the telescope to illustrate this throughout the film. At the beginning, Flick presents it to Princess Ada, but Dot is the only one who's interested in it. When the circus bugs arrive and Dot is being pursued by the bird, now Princess Ada uses it. When they're getting ready for the grasshoppers, now Alex Racco's character is using one. The ants obviously use a lot of tools and cleverness in constructing the giant bird. This sense of progress is demonstrated in a lot of ways. But I like how the telescope serves as a through line for the whole thing, a consistent symbol of change. The problem with these misunderstanding plots is that they tend to come tumbling down in a very clumsy way. P.T. Flea just comes out of nowhere to reveal what's going on, and Flick basically lays over and dies. His depression is mostly about him being a total screw-up, tying into his earlier scenes. But I don't feel like this is an interesting enough personal conflict for him to overcome, especially since he was just accused of putting himself before the colony. We obviously don't accept this assertion because the film has always portrayed Flick as acting in good faith. The film doesn't ever second-guess his motivations, questioning if his well-meaning deception is the right thing to do. It never explicitly suggests that Princess Ada should have the right to know. For Flick, the ends justify the means, even if it is coming from a good place. I don't know, there's definitely a more complex way you can look at what he did, a more nuanced way to portray the situation. So their decision to make the film's low point, I am a giant screw-up, they're all mad at me, feels a little basic. I don't care if it gives them an excuse to use the seed again. Or a rock. Now before we get to the climax of the film, I want to make a couple notes about the soundtrack and the visuals. Randy Newman is behind the music again, this time composing a rich orchestral theme. This theme opens and closes the film and hits some of the most powerful high moments. They might be a little over-reliant on this one musical hook, but it's so sweeping and grand that they kinda get away with it. Although when the credits song comes along and Randy Newman is crooning about bugs, it feels embarrassingly out of place. Like they're still stuck on some formula of what a Pixar film needs. No, Randy, you don't need to clamor on about bugs. The orchestration stuff works. This doesn't have to be exactly like Toy Story. Regarding the visuals, I love how A Bug's Life really shows off how many moving parts they can put into a scene. It's like they thought about The Lion King and how computers let Disney do that stampede scene. And they thought, why don't we just do that all the time? Toy Story wasn't a film with a huge cast of characters, so they didn't really get to show this off as much as they might have wanted. A Bug's Life is really where they get to let loose with the crowd scenes and build a gigantic busy colony, or a bustling city of bugs. It's something we definitely take for granted now, but it's a cool little evolutionary step that Pixar finally got to show off. Anyway, on to the finale. As a whole, it hits all the checkboxes, paying off all the earlier scenes, finally showing off the giant bird they built and fulfilling the seed metaphor with the kids' bravery. I especially like how they reuse the circus acts again, recreating the Chinese takeout box trick in order to whisk away the queen. Even P.T. Flea's burning death rears its ugly head again to become plot relevant. I kinda hate how they lean on that stupid flea ruining everything again, but I'll give them credit for incorporating fire back into the story. Pixar really seemed to have something against matches back in their early days. This sets up probably my favorite scene in the film, one of the more underappreciated Pixar moments. Okay, stay with me for a second, but what I love about the conclusion of Bug's Life is how much they beat the crap out of Flick. I know that sounds weird, but it's really unusual for a Pixar film. Can you think of another one where the protagonist physically gets beaten up this badly? It's probably The Incredibles, and that's it. And maybe WALL-E, but that one's kinda different. During Act 1, Flick steps forward against the grasshoppers, but is ultimately intimidated and backs down. It signals the success of Hopper's intimidation methods, as well as Flick's lack of confidence in his ideals. But this scene demonstrates that not only is Flick not backing down anymore, but is willing to literally sacrifice his life for his beliefs and ideas. When Flick hobbles himself back up and Hopper looks at him, I always think, oh god, he is so screwed. Like the guy can barely even walk. It's such a great man in the courtroom sort of scene. Just a character spilling his guts out about what he thinks is right and good. And having an intimidating character like Hopper, drenched in fire, staring him down and calling everyone a bunch of losers. I like the physical disparity of the showdown, that it's not just a giant battle between the protagonist and the antagonist. Flick is facing almost certain doom right here, and he proceeds anyway because he feels his message is more important than his own life. It's ultimately ideas that topples Hopper's kingdom, the nice little feeling that the truth will make people unite and stand together. Well, it's ideas and a bird that ultimately does Hopper in. Now there's an argument to be made that maybe the climax should have concluded before the storm, with the revolution taking care of business. But I like that the rain sequence lets Princess Ada demonstrate her character arc and take charge in the rescue mission. The rain effect is pretty cool as well, with the raindrops hitting the ground like bombs. The main climax is very talky, so we kinda need an action sequence to balance things out. The flight sequence itself doesn't do as much for me, as it's just a little too visually chaotic to keep the action straight. I love the culmination with the bird, however, even if Hopper might be a little too stupidly confident for this particular moment. But I get it. With such a grandiose and intimidating villain, you want to see him go out in probably the most humiliating and/or horrifying way possible. And this is probably it. Over time, I think what I appreciate most about A Bug's Life is its general sense of optimism about the world. Its sense of, boy howdy, we can all work together and make a better future for ourselves. That people aren't slaves to their circumstances, that they can rise up and create meaningful change. It's a little like what Brave tried to do with its theme about changing fate. Except A Bug's Life earns it because it demonstrates how systemic these issues are, and how ideas ultimately sow the seeds of change. If there's one major criticism of the film, is that maybe it's a little too married to its lofty ideals and problem solving, that it doesn't build meaningful relationships between the characters. Unlike Brave, it's not a relationship-driven film, so A Bug's Life comes off as being a little more impersonal than the typical Pixar film. We don't get a sense of the close bond between the characters, like how they did it with Marlin and Dory, or Carl and Russell, or Mike and Sully. Flick and Dot are about the closest we get, and even they spend half the film apart. Maybe this is why A Bug's Life is a forgotten film in Pixar's history. If so, I totally get it. But it's kind of a shame given the film's ultimate message. A Bug's Life feels like a more relevant film than ever, one of those stories that is needed for a good democracy. Even though the ants live under a monarchy. But whatever, you get what I mean. A Bug's Life remains one of Pixar's hidden surprises, a thoughtful and earnest little tale tucked away between their flashier entries. If you haven't seen it in a while, I encourage you to give it another watch. Maybe it'll surprise you. We'll probably never see A Bug's Life 2, and we'll probably never see that ant colony or circus troupe again. But that's okay. There are still nice little ideas in here that make this original film worth caring about. For me, it all started with a little seed. Or rock. Thanks for watching.